In 1851, over 6 million visitors walked through the Crystal Palace in London, marveling at the wonders of the most advanced civilization on Earth. Steam engines, electric telegraphs, Indian silks, diamonds from southern Africa. The Great Exhibition was built to showcase everything the British Empire had achieved. What none of those 6 million visitors mentioned in their letters home was the smell. Because behind the gleaming glass and iron of Victorian progress, ordinary people were living in conditions that would shut down a modern restaurant on sight. Their teeth rotted black from sugar and mercury. Their streets ran thick with horse manure and raw sewage. Their drinking water came from the same river where they dumped their dead animals. This is the disgusting truth about Victorian hygiene, and fair warning, it only gets worse from here. So brace yourself, because we are starting where every Victorian morning began, in a bedroom that had not seen fresh air in weeks. The average Victorian did not bathe the way people imagine today. For most of the 19th century, a full body wash was a rare event, something that happened once a week for the comfortable classes and far less often for everyone else. The reason was brutally practical. Running water did not reach most British homes until the 1870s and 1880s, and before that, preparing a single bath meant hauling bucket after bucket from a pump or communal well, then heating each one over a coal fire. The whole process could swallow the better part of an hour, and that was for one person. For working-class families packed into back-to-back terraced housing, the reality was a shared sponge bath. A basin of lukewarm water, one rag, and the whole family taking turns. The father went first because he came home filthiest from the factory or the coal face. Then the mother. Then the children in descending order of age. By the time the youngest got a turn, the water was gray, cold, and thick with someone else's grime. Wealthier families owned hip baths, shallow tin or copper tubs placed in front of the bedroom fire. Servants hauled hot water upstairs in cans, and after the bath, hauled the dirty water all the way back down. Even in grand households with a dozen servants, bathing more than once a week was considered eccentric. There are accounts suggesting Queen Victoria herself found once a week perfectly sufficient. Between baths, Victorians relied on their linen undergarments to absorb sweat and body oil. The logic was simple. Change the linen, and you were clean. The skin underneath went unwashed for days. This is why etiquette manuals placed obsessive emphasis on fresh underclothes and generous applications of cologne, lavender water, or rose water dabbed behind the ears. It was not vanity. It was survival, because the reek of an unwashed body sealed inside layers of wool and whalebone could hit you from across the room. The Victorians did not ignore the problem. They simply buried it under perfume and pretended it was not there. Victorian teeth were, to put it plainly, a catastrophe. The 19th century brought an explosion of cheap sugar into Britain from Caribbean plantations, and average consumption rocketed from roughly 18 pounds per person per year at the start of the century to nearly 90 pounds by the 1890s. Teeth that had endured centuries of coarse bread and salted meat simply could not survive this onslaught. By the time most Victorians reached 30, their mouths were a patchwork of cavities, abscesses, and gaps. The products available to fight this were questionable at best. Commercial toothpaste did not appear until the 1870s, and early formulas contained crushed brick dust, powdered charcoal, and chalk. Some recipes called for ground cuttlefish bone. Others recommended rubbing the teeth with salt or soot scraped from the chimney. The abrasives stripped enamel down to nothing, which only accelerated the rot they were meant to prevent. When a tooth finally gave out, and they gave out constantly, the only real option was extraction. Dentistry as a regulated profession did not exist for most of the era. Anyone could hang a sign and call themselves a dentist. Barbers pulled teeth. Blacksmiths pulled teeth. Traveling tooth drawers worked the market fairs with a tool called a dental key, a metal claw mounted on a rotating shaft that gripped the tooth and wrenched it out by brute force. The patient sat in a wooden chair. The operator braced his foot against the chair leg for leverage. No anesthetic was widely available before the 1840s, no antiseptic practice before the 1860s. Shattered neighboring teeth, broken jaws, and bone infections were routine. For the wealthy, there was another option: false teeth. The finest sets were carved from hippopotamus ivory and held in the mouth with gold springs that had to be manually clamped while eating. Cheaper alternatives used real human teeth harvested from battlefields. After the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, tens of thousands of teeth were pulled from the mouths of dead soldiers and shipped to London dentists, where they were mounted in ivory bases and sold as Waterloo teeth. Wearing a dead man's tooth in your own mouth was considered perfectly normal, so long as you could pay for it. The flush toilet existed during the Victorian era, but for most of the period it remained a luxury. The vast majority of households made do with chamber pots, ceramic bowls kept under the bed and used throughout the night. In the morning, the contents went out the window, into the garden, or down to the nearest cesspit. Cesspits were brick-lined holes in the ground, usually dug in the backyard or beneath the cellar, where human waste collected and slowly decomposed. They were supposed to be emptied regularly. In practice, they were emptied when they overflowed, which could mean months or even years of accumulation sitting beneath the house. The stench was overpowering. In 1849, a government sanitary inspector in London documented cesspits so full that waste had seeped through the brickwork into adjacent cellars where families lived and slept. A report from Bermondsey described children playing in a courtyard flooded with raw sewage several inches deep. The men who emptied these pits were called night soil men, and they worked after dark for a reason. Nobody wanted to witness what they were hauling. They climbed down into the pit with buckets and long-handled scoops, dug the waste out largely by hand, and loaded it into carts. The cargo was then hauled to farms outside the city limits, where it was spread as fertilizer on the fields that grew London's vegetables. The job paid roughly double a common laborer's wage. That premium existed because the work was so physically revolting that nobody would do it for less. Even households wealthy enough to own an early flush toilet were not safe from the filth. Water closets from this period connected directly to the cesspit or street sewer without any kind of water trap or seal. Gases from decomposing waste, primarily hydrogen sulfide and methane, drifted straight back up through the bowl and into the home. The rotten egg stench was so persistent in Victorian houses that many families simply accepted it as the normal smell of indoor life. Victorian hair was an elaborate production. The towering styles of the era, heavy updos, ringlets cascading past the shoulders, intricate braids pinned tight against the skull, required hours of preparation and an arsenal of products that would turn a modern stomach. The most popular styling product for men was Macassar oil, a thick, greasy pomade made from coconut oil, palm oil, and sometimes rendered animal fat. Men applied it so generously that the furniture industry responded by inventing an entirely new product, antimacassars, the small cloth covers draped over the backs of chairs and sofas, designed specifically to protect upholstery from the grease stains left by men leaning their oiled heads against the fabric. The fact that an entire category of household linen was named after the problem tells you how pervasive it was. Women faced a different ordeal. Without running water, washing long hair was a logistical nightmare, and most Victorian women washed their hair roughly once a month. Between washes, the scalp turned into an oily, itchy breeding ground. Lice were endemic across every level of society, from the poorest tenement to the grandest manor house. Fine-toothed combs carved from bone or ivory, called knit combs, were found in virtually every home. Picking lice and their eggs from the hair was a daily grooming task, as unremarkable as brushing. The treatments available for lice were arguably worse than the lice themselves. Mercury ointments were rubbed directly into the scalp. They killed the parasites effectively enough, but prolonged use caused skin ulcers, patches of permanent hair loss, and neurological damage. Kerosene was another popular remedy. Pour it on, let it soak, comb out the dead lice. It worked, but kerosene on the hair next to gas lamps and open coal fires was a disaster waiting to happen. Reports of women catching fire while doing housework after a kerosene lice treatment were not uncommon. The Victorians knew it was dangerous. They simply had nothing better. Laundry day in Victorian England was not a chore, it was an ordeal. A full wash day typically consumed an entire Monday, from before dawn until well after dark, and the physical labor involved was so punishing that many working-class families simply could not manage it every week. The process began the night before, when clothes were sorted and the worst stains were treated with lye, a caustic alkaline solution made by leaching water through wood ash. Lye was effective at breaking down grease and organic matter, but it was also corrosive enough to eat through skin on contact. Washerwomen who spent years handling lye developed a condition called washerwoman's hands: cracked, raw, permanently reddened skin that split open and bled at the knuckles. There was no remedy for it. You either wore the damage or you did not wash clothes for a living. On Monday morning, the copper, a large metal tub built over a brick firebox, was filled with water and heated. The clothes went in with blocks of hard soap, usually homemade from rendered tallow and lime, and were boiled and stirred with a wooden dolly or a passer, a heavy wooden pole with a copper head that was plunged up and down into the water like a churn. The steam, the heat, and the lye fumes turned the wash house into something closer to an industrial workshop than a domestic room. After boiling, each garment was lifted out with wooden tongs, carried to a washboard, and scrubbed by hand against the ridged surface until the dirt released. Then it was rinsed, wrung out, and fed through a mangle, a pair of heavy wooden or iron rollers that squeezed the water out. Mangles were genuinely dangerous machines. They had no safety guards of any kind, and fingers, hands, and even forearms were regularly caught and crushed between the rollers. Hospital admissions for mangle injuries were a recognized category in Victorian medical records. But the detail that truly earns Victorian laundry its place in a discussion of disgusting hygiene is the use of urine. Human urine contains ammonia, and ammonia is an effective bleaching agent. For centuries, collected urine had been used to whiten linens, and the practice persisted well into the Victorian period, particularly among poorer households that could not afford commercial bleach. Chamber pot contents that would otherwise go to the cesspit were saved, stored, and added to the wash water instead. The ammonia did its job. The clothes came out whiter. Whether they smelled better is another question entirely, though advocates insisted that a thorough final rinse removed any trace. Contemporary accounts from visitors to working-class homes suggest they were being optimistic. What nobody talks about is what happened to the wash water afterward. The filthy, lye-saturated, soap-scummed liquid, now containing the dissolved grime of an entire household's week, was simply dumped. In homes with a yard, it went straight onto the ground. In urban terraces, it poured into the gutter or the nearest drain, feeding into the same overwhelmed sewer system that was already failing to cope with the city's human waste. Step outside a Victorian home, and the streets offered no relief. The primary mode of transportation in 19th century Britain was the horse, and a single working horse produces between 15 and 30 pounds of manure per day. London alone had an estimated 300,000 horses at the peak of the Victorian era, which meant the city's streets absorbed several thousand tons of dung every single day. It piled on the roads, was ground into the cobblestones by iron-rimmed cartwheels, and in wet weather dissolved into a brown slurry that splashed onto the shoes, hems, and stockings of every pedestrian who dared cross the road. This is why crossing sweepers existed. Young boys, and they were almost always boys, earned pennies by clearing a path through the dung for well-dressed pedestrians who wanted to cross without destroying their clothes. Charles Dickens wrote about them. Henry Mayhew documented their lives in his landmark survey of London's working poor. They were a fixture of Victorian street life, and their entire occupation existed solely because the streets were blanketed in animal waste. The dung attracted its own economy. Pure finders were people, often elderly women, who collected dog excrement from the streets and sold it to tanneries where it was used in the leather softening process. They carried buckets and picked it up with their bare hands. Mayhew interviewed several of them in the 1850s and recorded that a diligent pure finder could earn 6 shillings a week, roughly the same as a seamstress, by gathering dog dung from dawn until dusk. Below the streets, a different class of worker operated in the sewers. Toshers crawled through London's underground tunnels hunting for coins, scrap metal, and anything of value that had been washed into the drains. They waded through raw sewage up to their waists, working by candlelight in tunnels that could flood without warning. The air was thick with methane and hydrogen sulfide, both capable of killing in high concentrations. Explosions were a known hazard. Rats were constant companions, and infected rat bites could be fatal in an era before antibiotics. Despite all of this, toshing was considered a reasonably profitable trade. That says less about the appeal of the work than about how desperately limited the options were for Victorian London's poor. And above it all hung the smell. Victorian cities stank in a way that is genuinely difficult for a modern nose to comprehend. Horse dung, rotting food waste, slaughterhouse runoff, open cesspits, tannery chemicals, and the smoke of millions of coal fires blended into a permanent atmospheric haze that visitors from the countryside described as physically nauseating. If the streets and the toilets were revolting, the food was worse, because at least a filthy street was visible. Victorian food adulteration was invisible, deliberate, and sometimes lethal. The problem was straightforward. Food regulation in 19th century Britain was virtually non-existent until the Adulteration of Food and Drink Act of 1860, and even after that, enforcement remained patchy and penalties trivial. This left bakers, grocers, and manufacturers free to stretch their products with whatever cheap fillers they could find, and stretch them they did. Bread, the staple of the Victorian diet, was routinely cut with alum, a chemical compound that made cheap flour appear whiter and helped the loaf rise higher. Alum is mildly toxic and causes stomach cramps, constipation, and with prolonged exposure, bone weakness. It was so widely used that finding a genuinely pure loaf in London was difficult for most of the century. Chalk and powdered bone were also added to flour for bulk. Ground plaster of Paris turned up in tested samples. A loaf of bread purchased from an ordinary London bakery in the 1850s might contain flour, water, alum, chalk, and whatever else the baker had available, and the customer would never taste the difference. Milk was watered down as a matter of routine, then whitened with chalk or plaster to hide the dilution. Tea leaves were dried, dyed with chemical colorants, and resold as fresh. Coffee was bulked with chicory, roasted grain, or baked liver ground to a fine powder. Sugar was stretched with sand. Pepper was mixed with floor sweepings. Mustard contained turmeric, chalk, and sometimes lead chromate to produce that bright yellow color. The most dangerous adulterant of all was lead. Lead was embedded throughout Victorian food processing. It lined storage containers, colored confectionery, and was present in the glazes used on cheap pottery. Children's sweets were frequently colored with lead-based pigments to give them their vivid reds and greens. Chronic lead exposure caused stomach pain, confusion, seizures, and death, and the Victorians consumed it unknowingly in their candy, their canned food, and their drinking water running through lead pipes. The worst single incident of food adulteration in Victorian Britain happened in Bradford in 1858. A market trader named William Hardaker sold humbugs that had been accidentally prepared with arsenic trioxide instead of the usual plaster of Paris filler. The mistake originated with a local druggist who supplied the wrong substance. Within days, over 200 people fell violently ill. 20 of them died, including children. The Bradford sweets poisoning became a national scandal and helped push Parliament toward the food safety legislation that eventually followed, though even after the laws passed, meaningful enforcement lagged for decades. What makes Victorian food adulteration truly stomach-turning is the sheer scale. Government chemists who analyzed food samples in the 1850s and 1860s found contamination in the majority of products they tested. A landmark study by the analyst Arthur Hassall, published in The Lancet beginning in 1851, examined samples of coffee, bread, tea, and milk purchased from ordinary London shops. Nearly every single one was adulterated. The Victorians were not eating food. They were eating food mixed with chalk, plaster, lead, and whatever else could be slipped in without detection. The consequences were not abstract. Chronic exposure produced a slow accumulation of damage that doctors of the era struggled to explain. Patients arrived with stomach complaints, bone pain, fatigue, and neurological symptoms that had no obvious cause. Many of these cases were almost certainly the result of years of quiet poisoning through the food supply, but without the tools to detect it, the medical profession had no framework to connect the dots. Victorian medicine was not merely ineffective. At its worst, it was an additional source of contamination, poisoning the very patients who came seeking help. Mercury was the wonder drug of the age. Doctors prescribed it for syphilis, tuberculosis, depression, constipation, and even teething pain in infants. It was delivered as pills, powders, ointments, and vapor baths. The side effects were devastating: uncontrollable drooling, loosening and loss of teeth, ulceration of the mouth and throat, tremors, personality changes, and kidney failure. The phrase "mad as a hatter" entered the English language because hat makers who used mercury compounds to cure felt developed neurological symptoms so consistently that the trembling and erratic behavior became synonymous with the trade. Arsenic was equally in demand. Fowler's solution, a liquid preparation containing arsenic trioxide dissolved in potassium bicarbonate, was prescribed as a general tonic for conditions ranging from asthma to anemia. Patients took it daily, sometimes for years on end, slowly accumulating a poison that caused skin lesions, peripheral nerve damage, and cancers of the liver and bladder. Victorian pharmacies sold arsenic compounds over the counter with minimal oversight. Bloodletting persisted well into the Victorian era despite growing evidence that it accomplished nothing useful. The preferred tool was the spring-loaded lancet, a blade that made a quick cut in the arm to release blood into a bowl. Leeches were the gentler alternative, applied to the skin and left to feed until they dropped off engorged. Barbers performed both procedures as a routine sideline. The red and white striped pole that still hangs outside barbershops today is a relic of this practice, the red representing blood and the white the bandages used afterward. Surgery, when it was attempted, took place without gloves, without sterilized instruments, and frequently without any hand washing at all. Surgeons operated in their street clothes and used the same unwashed tools from patient to patient. The operating theater had wooden floors that absorbed blood and pus with every procedure. Joseph Lister did not introduce antiseptic surgical techniques until 1867, and even then, many of his colleagues openly mocked the idea that invisible organisms on their hands could be killing their patients. The result was that Victorian hospitals were places where you went to get sicker. Infection rates after surgery were staggering, and a condition called hospital gangrene could tear through a ward, killing patient after patient within days. For much of the era, the safest medical strategy was simply to avoid doctors entirely. The Victorian beauty ideal demanded pale skin, bright eyes, and red lips. The products women used to achieve that look were toxic enough to kill them. The foundation of the fashionable Victorian complexion was lead white, a cosmetic paste made from lead carbonate that had been in use since antiquity. Women applied it across their faces, necks, and upper chests to achieve the porcelain finish that the era prized. It delivered results immediately. Over time, however, lead white caused the skin underneath to gray, crack, and develop open sores, which required more lead white to conceal, creating a cycle of damage and concealment that ended only when the user either stopped or died. And many of them died. Chronic lead poisoning from cosmetic use was a documented cause of death among Victorian women, yet the products continued to be manufactured and sold without any restriction. Eyes were enhanced with belladonna, a plant extract whose name translates to "beautiful lady" in Italian. A few drops of belladonna tincture dilated the pupils, giving the eyes a wide, luminous, almost feverish appearance. It also blurred vision, triggered headaches, elevated the heart rate, and in larger doses could cause hallucinations, seizures, and cardiac arrest. Women applied it before balls and dinner parties, then spent the evening navigating candlelit rooms essentially half-blind, relying on memory and the arm of a companion to avoid walking into the furniture. Perhaps the most unsettling practice was the deliberate consumption of arsenic. Arsenic wafers, small edible tablets containing measured doses of arsenic trioxide, were marketed directly to women as a beauty supplement. The advertising promised clearer skin, a brighter complexion, and a more youthful glow. The arsenic did produce a temporary flush by irritating the blood vessels near the surface of the skin. It also accumulated steadily in the liver, kidneys, and bones with every dose. The women who purchased and faithfully consumed these wafers were eating poison on purpose in careful daily portions in pursuit of a beauty standard that was quietly killing them from the inside out. The cosmetics trade of the era operated in a regulatory vacuum. No requirement to list ingredients, no authority to test for safety, no legal consequence for selling something that maimed its users. Everything described so far, the unwashed bodies, the overflowing cesspits, the horse-caked streets, the poisoned food supply, converged in the summer of 1858 in an event so foul that it forced the most powerful empire on earth to act. The Victorians called it the Great Stink, and it remains one of the most revolting public health crises in recorded history. By the middle of the 19th century, London's drainage system had buckled under the weight of its own population. The city had swelled from roughly 1 million people in 1800 to nearly 3 million by the 1850s, and the medieval network of drains and cesspits was never engineered to handle that volume. Raw, untreated sewage poured directly into the River Thames, the same river that supplied much of the city's drinking water. Cholera outbreaks in 1832, 1849, and 1854 killed tens of thousands of Londoners. Physician John Snow had demonstrated in 1854 that the disease spread through contaminated water, but the medical mainstream still clung to the theory that cholera was caused by foul air, a model known as miasma. Then came June of 1858. An unusually brutal heat wave baked the Thames into a stagnant, fermenting channel of human waste. The stench was so overwhelming that it penetrated the Houses of Parliament, which sit directly on the north bank of the river. Members of Parliament ordered the curtains soaked in chloride of lime to try to block the smell. It made no difference. Sessions were abandoned early. Committees relocated to rooms as far from the river as the building allowed. The Times reported that the Thames had become, and this is a direct quotation, a Stygian pool, reeking with ineffable and unbearable horror. The river was brown with excrement, and the summer heat was cooking it in the open air. The crisis accomplished in weeks what decades of public health campaigning had failed to achieve. Parliament authorized the construction of a massive new sewer system, designed by the civil engineer Joseph Bazalgette at a cost exceeding £3 million. Bazalgette built over 1,000 miles of street-level sewers feeding into 82 miles of main intercepting lines that carried waste eastward, away from the city center, to pumping stations at Beckton and Crossness on the Thames estuary. The project consumed 6 years and over 300 million bricks. Much of the system is still in use today. The Great Stink was, in its own repulsive way, a turning point. It proved that the British government would only invest in public sanitation when the filth reached the doorstep of the people who wrote the laws. As long as the sewage stayed in the slums of Bermondsey and Whitechapel, Parliament could look away. The moment the stench drifted into the chamber where legislation was debated, suddenly the funding appeared, the engineers were commissioned, and the problem was addressed within the decade. So the next time someone rhapsodizes about the elegance of the Victorian era, remember what that elegance was built on top of. Urine-bleached linens, lead-painted faces, streets paved in horse manure, a river of sewage running through the heart of the greatest city on earth. If you lasted through this entire video, your stomach is stronger than most. Drop a comment and tell us which part was the hardest to sit through. And if you want more history that polite society would rather you forgot, hit subscribe. There is plenty more filth where this came from.